So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Anastasios Perimenis, Secretary General of CO2 Bio Europe. And on behalf of the consortium of Takeoff, we would like to welcome you in this webinar talking about the importance of synthetic aviation fuels amidst fluctuating energy prices in the general energetic context of the EU. Takeoff is a EU-funded project that is working on the production of synthetic renewable aviation fuels from CO2, water, and renewable electricity. And today we have four distinguished speakers that will guide us through the development of synthetic aviation fuels in Europe. First with Lovin Zubair from TNO, the coordinators of Takeoff, that will present the project. Then Daniel Maren from ENGIE that will explain about the importance of CCU and green hydrogen in the development of the synthetic aviation fuel branch. Tudy Bernier, Senior Policy Manager from CO2 Bio Europe, will present the policy context, also specific to synthetic aviation fuels. And Hendrik Wenzel, professor from SDU, will discuss the cost competitiveness of synthetic aviation fuels. You will be able to ask your questions directly in the chat, in the Q&A. If you would like, you can also raise your hand and you will be given or to ask your question after each speaker. So without further ado from my side, I will give the word to Lovin Zubair from TNO, coordinators of the Takeoff, that will explain about the project. And I hope you will all enjoy this webinar. So Lovin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will take it from here, share my screen. You see in the slide? All right. So let's start. Indeed, I'm Lovin Zubair, working at TNO as a senior scientist and process development engineer. We are working on the production of synthetic renewable aviation fuels from CO2, water, and renewable electricity. So why are we working on sustainable aviation fuels, or abbreviated by SAF? So the SAF is a sustainable kerosene, is the only short to mid-term possibility to make aviation sustainable. Well, why? Because kerosene is a huge market. We are talking about 317 billion liters by 2022. And existing planes will be using this for decades. It's unlike what we have in cars and heavy road transportation on international roads, which can switch to batteries or hydrogen on the short or mid-term. So there are multiple technological routes we'll have to contribute to the SAF production. Each has its own merits and challenges, of course, depending on the feedstock and the technology maturity. So we see here a graph from Clean Skies, where we start with the HEFA, so the left on the left-hand side. HEFA stands for hydrogenated esters and fatty acids. Well, here's this is a low-hanging fruit, since it's a safe, proven, and scalable technology. Nevertheless, the feedstocks are waste and residue liquids, such as used cooking oil, and also purposely grown oil trees grown on degraded land. However, it has limited feedstock for to be used in a huge market where we are talking about 370 billion liters. On the other hand, we have alcohol to jet. The feedstock here for this technology is this technology is already being commercially piloted, and the feedstock includes biomass that can be transformed into ethanol. However, processing biomass into jet fuel through ethanol requires a lot of feedstock again. Moreover, it forms a possible competition with the food chain, and that's something that we need to consider and then take also the ethics into account in this case. On the other hand, we have also the gasification, which is actually Fischer-Tropsch. So we use a similar feedstock as alcohol to jet, plus municipal waste, solid waste, and feedstock is in that case firstly gasified to produce syngas, a combination of hydrogen and carbon monoxide, which is subsequently fed into a Fischer-Tropsch reactor where hydrocarbons are produced. On the other hand, we have this so-called power to liquids. So this pathway starts with a different method of producing syngas, either electrolysis of the captured CO2 with hydrogen. So whatever the color of the hydrogen, preferably of course green. And the reverse water gas shift reaction, or directly can be also in a SOEC, so the so-called solid oxide electrolysis cell, where you fed CO2 and steam and produce syngas, so CO and hydrogen. The carbon that's used here in this power to liquid can be from three different sources. So point sources from the industry, so the flue gases, or the DAC, direct air capture, where you can capture the CO2 from the atmosphere directly, or from sustainable biomass, so-called BECCS, so bioenergy carbon capture and storage. So the synthetic kerosene produced from CO2, hydrogen, and electricity is currently still more expensive, but has an unlimited fissile, which is CO2 and water, providing that we have cheap and renewable electricity. At the moment, the airlines are using every last drop of available stuff, even at very high prices. So we need to ramp up this production of the stuff via power to liquids. Well, all of these routes, as we see in the last line now, offer substantial emission reduction potentials compared to fossil jet fuel, and synthetic kerosene can go even almost reaches 100% greenhouse gas reductions. At the moment, SAF ramp up, as we see in the table below, is actually increasing from 2% to 63% in 2050. At least that's the incentive, and we see that the biofuels at the moment is more than the half. So we see that the so-called RFNBOs, which stands for renewable fuels. Renewable fuels of non-biological origin are still actually lower than the half. So we need to work on that. It's important for the synthetic fuels is underlined by the governmental targets and incentives and the market. So that's also like political decisions, of course. Further technological development is necessary to reduce the costs. So what we do within Takeoff is that we are developing. We are developing a unique technology whereby CO2 is hydrogenated to kerosene via olefins. So we start either from flue gas emission or direct air capture, where CO2 is captured, and combine it with hydrogen, convert it to light olefins, further oligomerize it and hydrogenate it to higher alkanes, which is the blend of the stuff. The innovations are focused on developing and improving catalysts, which are with high selectivity and efficiencies, next to reactors under industrial relevant technologies. So here we are working, for instance, with reactors that remove the waters to shift the reactions to the right, so to produce more products than limited by the thermodynamics. The objective is to significantly increase the efficiency and reduce cost compared to the existing power to liquid benchmark, which is at the moment the Fischer-Tropsch reactions. So compared to the benchmark, we see, of course, we know that Fischer-Tropsch is industrially proven and certified for use as aviation fuel. This route is therefore the industrial benchmark for us, for our comparison studies. And we must say that we are not against, and we are not competing with the FT technology, because we also work on the reverse water gas jet reaction for producing hydrogen and CO at the right ratio. This is an important parameter to control the reaction output, of course, because, for instance, for kerosene, the ratio is of hydrogen to CO is 2.1. However, if we look at this graph on the right hand, top right, we see that the product composition, which is in percentages, against the carbon number, we see that the blue and the orange curves, we see more or less, well, it's not a normal distribution, but the distribution is quite wide. So that means, it's almost statistically distributed. So you have a large number of hydrocarbons in the low range, and also a significant amount also in the high range of chain length, where it's not within the jet fuel. So that's therefore you need, in the case of Fischer-Tropsch, so after the syngas and then the Fischer-Tropsch reaction, you need an additional hydrocracker to boost the production of the kerosene fuel blend. In the takeoff, we have two lines that we are developing. The blue one, we see that CO2 is hydrogenated first to methanol, in some cases also to dimethyl ether. It's a more conservative way, because this MTO technology is, of course, proven technology. It's well known. It is from methanol we go to light olefins, and then the oligomerization to higher olefins, and further hydrogenation to paraffins and kerosene. The more challenging line, that's the green line, that's the bottom line, where we are hydrogenating the CO2 directly to light olefins. So, for instance, ethylene and propylene. We are mostly interested in ethylene. And that ethylene is then further reacting towards the kerosene, again through oligomerization. So at the moment, we are working on reducing the byproducts of this route. Here our partners are developing catalysts that we are using, but we need to further optimize the catalyst blends for reducing the byproducts. Of course, we don't do this alone. So just to say one thing about again, to emphasize that the takeoff technology compared to Fischer-Tropsch, we see here that the product distribution, so it's way narrower for the takeoff technology compared to the Fischer-Tropsch. So that's also what we are aiming at. So to have a blend within C8 to C18. We have here the partners at our advisory board. So for the catalyst development is happening in the labs of CNRS, our partners in Lille. The reactor technology that we do here, so we are mainly focusing on how to remove the byproduct water in situ to boost the reactions to higher productivity. A demonstration will happen at the RWE premises. The compliance and emissions, so our partners at FEV and Aachen are working on the structure property relationship, and then to see how to minimize the emissions, soot and NOx, etc. Techno-economic analysis and life cycle assessment happens at the SDU, at the university in Denmark. Disseminations is in the hands of CO2 value in Europe. So to give you a glance of the experimental setups that we have and that we are using for executing our experiments. So we have the demo plant in RWE. We see here a rapid compression machine for NOx measurements. We see a decarbonization test where you have polymerizations of light olefins to higher olefins. And you see also our reactor. We call it CNF for the removal of water, and then the production of methanol or DME, and then which is then further reacting. But at the moment, we are also working on how to go directly from CO2 and hydrogen to light olefins. On the bottom left, you see high throughput reactor. So here is a 16 parallel reactors where you can use as for screening purposes. Well, under different relevant conditions, well, feed, the temperature, pressure, compositions of the catalyst can be changed to optimize these conditions. So what do we expect from this research? What's the impact of takeoff, I must say, projects? Well, there are a couple. So we are developing the process for the conversion of CO2 to methanol DME and increase the technology readiness level from 3 to 5, because these intermediates can be also used either to solve, but also like in other markets. They have their own markets. Advance an innovative olefins to jet fuel process from TRL3 to 4, and investigate the compliance and emissions of the produced SAF, because we want to use it as a drop-in product. So it must, of course, comply with the existing requirements. We want also, within the RWE premises, demonstrate the entire technology. So from CO2 capture, hydrogen, water conversion to hydrogen using electricity, and converting it all the way to kerosene. And the techno-economic will be in place to of course, determine the efficiency, the footprint, and the sustainability and cost reduction of these processes. We expect a carbon and hydrogen efficiency of 25% above the Fischer Tropsch, because we have a narrower product distribution for the jet fuel blend. We don't expect sulfur because there's no sulfur in the feed. There will be also no sulfur in the product. Lower emissions, because then the product is more optimized than the usual that's used now. At the end of the route, we also expect that the cost of the SAF production will be reduced because of optimizing the different processes and the efficiencies, and also like boosting the production beyond the thermodynamic limitation. So to stay in touch with us, we have different outlets. There's a website. There's on LinkedIn you can connect to us, and also we are open for relevant industrial partners. Thank you, Frank. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Louine. Just one question before we go to the next speaker, and it's about the renewable energy implementation. So what would the carbon intensity of the production process be without renewable electricity? And from a project development point of view, will the renewable energy deployment be incorporated into the project design?
Yeah. So in the LCA studies, we look into different scenarios. So we look into indeed the renewable energies and also other sources of energy, and that also goes for the hydrogen production. Yeah. So we take that into account, and then we will also quantify the impact on the cost, but also on the footprint of the kerosene produced.
Henrik, you would like to add, I guess, on that?
I have a quick question about the LCA on the HEFA, using the waste cooking oil. What I hear from life cycle assessment experts is that the waste cooking oil around the world is already used for several purposes, and the result of using more of it is that the French fries become cleaner, meaning that they're just using more cooking oils to create more waste cooking oils, and the marginal will then be palm oil anyway, virgin palm oil. What is your knowledge about it?
So that part is actually in the hands of our partners, and I do agree that is, of course, the source of HEFA can be also expanded beyond the cooking oil and then the waste oil and this type of work. But I'm not an LCA expert. I can park this come back to this question if necessary from our partners.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. So in the interest of time, I will proceed with the next speaker, but we will gather the questions and maybe discuss about them during the webinar or offline also. So the next speaker is Daniel Marin, energy solution architect from ENGIE, and he will talk about the importance of hydrogen and CCU in the context of fluctuating energy prices. Daniel, the floor is yours.
You're on mute, Daniel, in case.
Yes.
I was muting myself. Okay, so now you hear me, I guess.
Yes, all good.
Okay, so I will maybe come back to the fundamentals of the energy transition and why we need hydrogen, and why, in fact, basically SAF and CCU in general is very good to accelerate everything. So the basics, and basically CCU and everything has no sense if we don't go back to the global goal, which is the carbon neutrality in 2050. And carbon neutrality doesn't not means only the renewable electricity and transforming the current electricity into renewable electricity. It's much more, as we see here. Only 20% of the final energy use is today electricity, and the rest is a bit of renewable, 10%, but for the rest it's fossil fuel with petroleum and gas. And the electricity we do, it will increase, because basically this is the cheapest way to achieve the carbon neutrality, is to electrify everything what is feasible. But some things are not feasible to electrify, and also you can electrify, but at the end of the day you need also some cables or infrastructure, and also the infrastructure will not be sufficient. So that's why we will use the renewable heat and more, but it will remain quite limited, because simply the feedstock is limited. Carbon capture and storage, we see now that it's running, and it will continue. And hydrogen and power to X, like CCU, will take a place, but be aware that it is a very expensive way, because basically it is more expensive to use hydrogen than pure electricity, simply because you need to use electricity to go to hydrogen. So there is an efficiency point of view, and so you will go only in the hard-to abate sector, where in fact you cannot electrify the thing. So that's why for e-fuels, it's clearly something that we have to target, is where you cannot use the electricity. For single car, for instance, electrical car seems to be better, but for trucks and for aviation, clearly there is this another story. Repo EU and the current stress on the energy market has shown at least one thing: we have to accelerate absolutely and desperately the development of all renewable electricity that we can in Europe. Clearly the development will be wind and solar. Wind more for the Atlantic part, I would say, with UK, Ireland, and all the North Sea coast up to Baltic Sea, in fact, and a bit in the Mediterranean Sea also, as you see. And for the solar, it will be more in the south, of course, because there is more solar in the south. But once more, these are not base load production. So if we want to increase that, we need absolutely develop also some storage capacity of electricity, or simply transform directly, or as fast as possible, the electricity produced into a valuable molecule that can be used after for the rest of the economy. When we speak about the storage of electricity, you see that there is a lots of possibility for the storage of electricity, like the batteries, of course, the hydro pump storage, the thermal storage, because we will more and more see some electric boiler in order to transform directly the electricity into heat and then to use it, or to reuse eventually to produce electricity. And then we have the hydrogen and eventually the power to methane, which allows in fact to store a lot of quantity of electricity, and that can be used after. But of course, due to the fact that there is an efficiency, the best is most probably not to use this molecule directly to reproduce electricity, because simply you lose a lot of energy. So the power to gas to power, it's about 30% of efficiency. So it means that if you produce 100 megawatt hour of electricity with solar, for instance, you transform into hydrogen and you go back to electricity with CCGT, gas, or hydrogen, you will have only 30 megawatt hour of energy. It means that you will lose a lot. So basically, if you can produce some other valuable molecule, it is much better than to go for electricity back. So basically, that's where the hydrogen will play a role. So you have a lot of electricity, you don't know exactly what to do, then you transform this electricity into hydrogen. Then today, you can ask yourself, okay, what can I do with this hydrogen today? So today, you can use the hydrogen for two major sectors, I would say, in Europe. This is the ammonia production for basically fertilizer, and these are the refinery. The problem is that today the ammonia sector is absolutely not ready to pay any premium on green hydrogen. We see, by the way, that with the increase of price of the gas, who are the first installation to stop activities, it was the ammonia production, basically everywhere in Europe. In UK, I saw an ammonia plant just shutting down because of the price of energy. So clearly, there is no willingness to pay an additional premium for green hydrogen for the ammonia, at least in Belgium. The refinery, clearly, we will electrify more and more the mobility. So as a consequence, the refinery will decrease. So basically, we will need less refinery, but the refinery, clearly there is a willingness to pay an additional premium on green hydrogen, because simply they can sell it then green fuel. So it's a sort of CCU, I would say, but with existing assets. You have, of course, new assets that you can use, where you can use green hydrogen. This is the green steel, so the DRI, direct reduction iron, to go to replace the current blast furnace. But as it is to replace blast furnace, it means that you need a lot of investment upfront in order to develop this this technology, and without infrastructure, it's quite challenging to develop these things, because you need a lot of hydrogen for the steel production, and if you have no transport and storage infrastructure, it will not be developed. Mobility, hydrogen mobility is a very nascent market, and it will take some time to become mature. And heat and electricity production, as I mentioned, is probably not the first thing to develop today. It's better to go for the molecule, and all these use are basically baseload use, except for mobility, but these are baseload use. And then it comes to another challenge with the hydrogen economy, is that today there is a very, very limited infrastructure to transport the hydrogen, so it has to be developed. Because simply this infrastructure is only sized for the current use of hydrogen. So if you want to develop, you need somehow to have a business model. And also, you have to know that to store the hydrogen in big quantity today, the only way, or the proven way, is a salt cavern. but it's not used for the hydrogen today, though there are some demo projects and it will come. But even if you imagine to transform all the salt cavern today used for the gas storage into hydrogen, you have to keep in mind that with the thermodynamic density of energy of the hydrogen, you will lose a lot of possibility of energy storage, because you divide it by 4 the quantity of energy you can store with hydrogen compared to natural gas. So basically in Europe, it means that today we have 1,200 terawatt hour of gas storage capacity, with 200 terawatt hour only on salt cavern. And if you transform this salt cavern into hydrogen, it's only 50 terawatt hours. So it will not solve the problem of storage of energy. And I will add to that, if you have no big project with big possibility to implement infrastructure and storage, you will never start, in fact, the hydrogen economy. So clearly, hydrogen economy will need some, I would call it iconic project in order to develop this infrastructure. As I mentioned before, the business model is quite challenging. So who is really able and who wants to pay a premium? And that's where SAF and other e-molecules, e-fuels are coming into consideration. Is basically today, it's obvious that aviation, you will never go only with green hydrogen, because simply, once more, the energy density of hydrogen is too small compared to the kerosene, and so you will always need kerosene for your planes. And so the only that, as mentioned by the previous speaker, it's a lot of energy. If you take only the 5% of renewable SAF, so bio and E, that it's needed in Europe into 2030, it's already 40 terawatt hours. So it's a big volume. You have on the shipping industry, you have the same trend. Shipping is now also pushed by Europe to add some renewable fuel. So you will have LNG, methanol, eventually e-diesel. But today, obviously, we see mainly e-methane and e-methanol as candidate to go for the carbon neutrality. And once more, it's also a huge volume. In the customer driven, you will have, especially for the petrochemical industry, so in the plastic, I would say, you have a push for the customer to have more and more green or recycled plastics. And obviously, if you come from CO2 with hydrogen back to plastics, is the final cycle of the plastics. So there you see also a starting of push of the market. And in the steel today, for instance, the car or the wind offshore is asking for green steel, so carbon neutral steel. This you can today produce it basically with electric arc furnace recycled steel, and then replace the natural gas that is used for the post-processing by e-methane. So that's you can do it today, and in the future you can go for pure hydrogen or for e-methane, because never forget that you will use big quantity of hydrogen base load, and so it could be easier, in fact, to use e-methane in order to produce the green steel, of course, with an extra cost, but at least the market is starting to look for a green premium. So to conclude this this presentation, I would say that we are entering now in a very, very big challenging period, because we need to achieve the carbon neutrality in 2050. And it is a very big challenge. The electrification will really boost the production of renewable at a level that we have never seen before. So everybody is now aware that we will go more and more for electricity everywhere. And so, of course, the electricity storage will be very key, but will also be the bottleneck. And that's where the hydrogen will play a very, very important role, because it can be a buffer when you have a production of electricity which is not base load, and you need to flatten the profile. But of course, if you do not have any infrastructure, you cannot do that. And to make an infrastructure, you need a business model. If you have no business model, you will not build any infrastructure. And today, in Europe, for the sectors able to pay green premium is clearly the e-fuel. So that's why the CCU is very key at the beginning of now, to boost and to develop everything in order to build the low carbon system for the future. Voilà, that's all, and I'm ready for some questions.
Thank you, Angie. Sorry. Thank you, Daniel. So I don't see a question for you in the chat. There's a question for Lawen. I don't know if we want to take it now. It's about the preference to ethylene compared to propylene as a preferred olefin intermediate. Maybe Lawen, you can comment on that, and meanwhile, let me invite also all attendees to ask their questions in the chat. So, Lawen,
Yep.
Can you comment on that?
Yes, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so the preference for ethylene above propylene is because of branching. In case of propylene, you can have branching, and we saw the soot production, for let's say straight molecules more weight less than for branched ones. So that's why we are actually kind of So also in the jet fuel blend, you see more straight molecules than branched ones. So that's the main reason for targeting the ethylene.
Okay. A question for Daniel. I would ask is, how could companies address the renewable electricity intermittence in e-fuel and SAF projects?
So the SAF process has a little bit of flexibility, of course, and in between you can put some storage. So in fact, basically in a eSAF project, you will have two sort of so you will have the sourcing of renewable, which could be a blend of different type of renewables. You are not obliged to be directly connected to one single, for instance, wind offshore or solar industry. So you go on the grid, and then you make a blend of different type of renewables. So that's a bit flatten already the profile. Then you have some batteries that you can use in order to really cover some peaks of production to flatten once more. And then you can store the hydrogen and the CO2, because CO2 you can also store, in order to really buffer this. Of course, the more you have infrastructure with storage capacity, the more you can play. So this is clearly challenging at the beginning, but okay, we have no other choice. So this is today the way we can address this problematic.
Thank you, Daniel. Henrik?
Well, just briefly, I'm also addressing that issue in my presentation, and there are also some other means to do it.
Indeed, there are some financial type questions, but I will ask them then, but we can also note them for your presentation afterwards, Henrik. One of them is, what would be the profitability and the payback for new SAF development now? So I don't know if Daniel or Henrik, maybe you have you have a comment on that, or maybe Henrik, you addressed this issue in your presentation.
Yeah, we can talk about it in my
Let's talk about it now. Yeah.
Henrik is more relevant than me.
And also, what sort of financing would SAF companies require to increase their capacity? That's also a question.
In fact, I would say for financing, what is crucial is the willingness to pay for some customer, and knowing that the market is there. When the regulation is there and shows that there is a need, you will have to develop, and then there will be a lot of development of SAF, and the cheapest will win. So it could stay very expensive compared to the current production of kerosene, so fossil kerosene. But we are not competing against this. We are competing against other sources of SAF, and if the customer is there and the volume is there, to get the money on the financial market, I don't think it's an issue.
Okay. And the last question, also addressed again to Loween. If we're not talking about SAF as a finality, if we're only stopping at the olefin production, would this also be a sustainable technology as a standalone for olefin production, and would these accelerate the TRL level of the technology?
So I think so, because then you are not going to oligomerization to higher olefins, which is also needs to be optimized there, and then further hydrogenation to paraffins, either branched or straight. So definitely, and then you see also when you have olefins, there is also different markets. Just for instance, there is also, they can be used for plastics. So yeah, the answer is yes.
Thank you. The next question will be addressed also by the next speaker. So it's a nice lead-in to Dudy Bernier, Senior Policy Manager from CO2 Value Europe, and he will be talking about the policy context, also specifically on sustainable and synthetic aviation fuels, and he will also answer on the mandatory requirements and the different quotas on SAF. So, Dudy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you just confirm, Anastasios, that you hear me okay?
We hear you and we see the presentation all
Okay,
good.
very good. Thanks a lot. And thanks everyone, and really happy to be there and to make this presentation. So I'm Dudy Bernier. I'm working for CO2 Value Europe, so one of the partners in Takeoff, and I'll try to walk you through what are the main policy and regulatory developments that are relevant for synthetic aviation fuels in particular. We'll also look at the broader kind of policy environment. I'll try to do that in 20 minutes and to keep some time for questions. So if you have any, do not hesitate to ask them. Okay, so I mean, it was already addressed by some of the speakers. So the main goal of the EU right now in the current Commission, so going from 2019 to 2024 in its mandate, so with the President Ursula von der Leyen, is their EU Green Deal. So this is the goal for the European Union to reach climate neutrality by 2050. So not only carbon neutrality, but climate neutrality as well. In order to do that and to start to be on track for reaching climate neutrality, the European Union has put forward what is referred to as the Fit for 55 package, which is 13 different EU legislations aiming to build a regulatory framework to reduce by 55% GHG emissions by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. So that's why we say Fit for 55. It's for the EU to be fit for the reduction of 55% of GHG emissions by 2050. So you see on the right side of the slide all the different aspects and the different actions that are taken by the EU, from agriculture to energy efficiency, energy taxation, carbon border adjustment mechanism, and all the parts around transport and so on and so forth. So I won't go into the detail of each of those legislations. I'll try to focus on which legislations are relevant for synthetic aviation fuels in particular. This was addressed already by some of the speakers, but just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So when we talk about fuels and its definitions at EU level, the decisive factor is not the technology that you use, it's not the carbon source that you use, it's not even anymore the type of end use that you have. What matters for your definition is where your energy is coming from. And so sorry if the slide is a bit busy, but that way you have all the definitions, and these slides will be available after, so you can have a closer look if you need. So if we start from the left-hand side, so you already heard from previous speakers about RFNBOs. So RFNBOs, renewable fuels of non-biological origin. This means basically fuels that are made from renewable energy sources that are not biomass. So this is wind power, solar power, hydropower, etc., etc. Some of the synonyms, let's say, to RFNBOs can be e-fuels, synthetic fuels, CCU fuels. You can hear different words, but in the EU legislation, you'll always hear about RFNBOs. So through my presentation, I'll keep referring to it as RFNBOs. So bear in mind that these are RFNBOs because you use renewable energy as your energy sources, as the basis for your hydrogen, basically, that will be used in your fuel. One of the main aspects is that you need to reach a 70% reduction GHG compared to a fossil equivalent. So to try to make that clear, if you have fossil methanol and then you have e-methanol, for your e-methanol to be considered as an RFNBO, you need to demonstrate that your e-methanol has a 70% reduction in terms of GHG intensity compared to its fossil equivalent throughout its entire life cycle. So some of the examples that you can have in mind for RFNBOs, e-methane, e-methanol, e-kerosene, and just so that we're all clear, renewable hydrogen as such is considered as an RFNBO. Okay, now if we move to other definitions, so for example, low carbon fuels. So this is still in the making. We're still waiting for some of the details to be finalized in the EU legislation, but in essence, here, the energy content is derived from low carbon hydrogen. So you can think, for example, about hydrogen made from nuclear energy, which is not considered renewable, but that is considered low carbon. Blue hydrogen could also be in this definition, but all of this still needs to be finalized under EU law. There's a delegated act, so this is a kind of an executive order, if you will, or a decree of application that is supposed to come end of 2024. Then one of the hard ones is recycled carbon fuels. Maybe it's less relevant for the discussion today, so I'll just mention it briefly. But these are basically when the energy content is not coming from a renewable source. So for example, a waste exhaust gas, which is unavoidable, in industrial installations. So for example, in a steel mill, if you have a CO that is coming from steel making and you use that to make a fuel, it can qualify as recycled carbon fuel. And the reason for this is that the energy source is not renewable. It doesn't really fit in the RFNBO category. It doesn't really fit in the low carbon fuel category. So there's a specific category for recycled carbon fuels. And then the last ones, so that was already mentioned, under EU law, these are referred to as biomass fuels. This is essentially biofuels. You have a number of criteria that must be respected under the Renewable Energy Directive revision. So we refer to it as RED 2. There's 4 types of biofuels that can be in there, but maybe more relevant to this group and to this webinar are what are the definitions for sustainable aviation fuel. So we hear a lot about SAFs. We have to bear in mind that SAFs mean it's the umbrella term, right? So it's all the fuels that are considered as sustainable, and it's essentially 3 of them. So it's synthetic aviation fuels, which is effectively RFNBOs for aviation. So what I just mentioned, you have your energy content that is coming from renewable sources other than biomass. And then for biofuels, it's only 2 categories that are considered, at least in the proposal that was made by the Commission. It's advanced biofuels. So it's a list of feedstock that is listed under the regulation. I've listed a few of them here, algae, biomass, waste, some different oils and so on, which are debated and discussed at EU level. And then the third category, it was also mentioned by previous speaker, used cooking oil and animal fats, which can qualify as sustainable aviation fuel. So for me, the main message here is when you hear about SAF, bear in mind that it's those three different categories that you hear about. When you hear about synthetic aviation fuels, this is specifically RFNBOs that is coming from renewable energy sources that are not biomass. Okay, so the EU environment, let's say, it's a number of different legislations that are relevant for synthetic aviation fuel. So there's not like just one legislation that you can have a look at and think, okay, all the information that I need is in there. You need to bear in mind that there's a complex kind of ecosystem of regulations that are currently being debated. And so I've listed some of them here. The EU ETS system, so the emission trading scheme. This is basically the most energy intensive industries paying for the CO2 that they emit. And in the new regulation that was adopted in December 2022, there's a number of new provisions that are relevant, in particular for CCU fuels, for RFNBOs. For example, provisions to make sure that when you're using CO2 to produce RFNBOs, that it's not double counted. So let's say if you're capturing your CO2 from your cement plant or your lime plant or your steel plant, that you're transporting it, converting it, and using it in a plane, the new rules will make sure that it's not accounted for twice, that the CO2 it's accounted for only once, and it will be accounted at the place where it was originally generated. So in this case, in the cement plant or in the steel plant or in the lime plant. Then a second one that was quite important and also adopted is the specific rules for ETS for aviation. So I won't go into detail, but historically, aviation hasn't been fully integrated in the ETS system, and now they will. Now all airlines and all aviation activities will be included under the ETS. So what this means in practice is that for now, there was a number of free allowances under ETS. So that means free rights to emit CO2, if you will. And those will be phased out by 2027. So progressively between 2024 and 2027, the free allowances for airlines will disappear, meaning that the airlines will need to pay basically for the CO2 that they're emitting. So that will be a major kind of game changer for the aviation sector. As part of this ETS aviation, there is a number of dedicated funds that are planned. So I've listed some of them here. Take the numbers with a bit of caution because this is based on the current price of ETS allowances. So this may change in the future, but this is to give you a ballpark. So there's dedicated fund for innovation up to 450 million of euros that are planned by using the ETS fees that are paid basically by industries that will fund the innovation fund as a whole. And then there's a dedicated mechanism up to 1.8 billion euros to help the transition of the aviation sector for sustainable aviation fuel. So there's a number of real important funding mechanisms that have been agreed on at EU level and that will be in place. There's also this part about using this fund, and in particular this 1.8 billion euros as a way to cover the cost differential between the production of synthetic aviation fuels and their fossil equivalents. So the EU saying we know that there's a difference between the price of regular kerosene and e-kerosene, and we want to use some of this money to try to compensate, at least in the ramp-up phase, for the price differential. So quite an important financial incentive. And then there were some questions in the chat previously already about this. So from let's say a renewable energy perspective level. So there was the adoption of RED III, which is the third revision of the Renewable Energy Directive. And in there, EU policymakers have agreed that for the transport sector as a whole, so everything, rail, road transport, aviation, maritime, and so on, they will need to reach 5.5% of energy coming either from advanced biofuels or from RFNBOs. So that's a combined target between the two definitions that I mentioned earlier. There is, however, a sub-target for RFNBOs where the EU is telling 1% needs to come from RFNBOs, and this is mandatory. So this is one of the first time that you have a specific quota where EU policymakers and EU law is requiring for member states to reach this 1%. So even if this can seem as relatively modest as an objective, this is still a very strong sign to say countries will need to invest into RFNBOs as per EU law, and for those RFNBOs to be used in the transport sector. And then the final part, maybe less relevant for today, is also that there are a number of incentives for using RFNBOs in industries at large. So these are all elements that are important under RED 3. Now, for the aviation sector in particular, there is a legislation called Refuel Aviation EU, which is still under negotiation. So the first three that you saw have been already adopted. Refuel EU Aviation is still under negotiation. It's actually tomorrow that the final trilogue is taking place. So tomorrow or Wednesday, we'll have the final numbers. Here, the logic is to say we want to have SAF quotas. So you remember both advanced biofuels, certain type of biofuels like animal fats and cooking oils, and renewable aviation fuels. So having very ambitious SAF quotas by 2025, 2030, 2040, 2050, and then having dedicated synthetic aviation fuels quotas by those dates as well. So these will be as well like very clear signals given to the aviation sector that they need to move towards more sustainable fuels. And then there's a last directive that is still under discussion and where there hasn't been a lot of progress around the energy taxation directive and the fact that there would be a zero taxation rate for FNBOs, in particular for aviation. This is still under discussion and hasn't progressed a lot. There's also the RED 2 delegated acts that are really important. I'll come back to that in a second. I already mentioned this, so I can go pretty quickly. Some of these have been adopted already, so this will become law. The Refuel EU Aviation will be negotiated tomorrow, and then the Energy Taxation Directive is one of the directive where there has been less progress, let's say, at EU level. For EU aviation, I mean, I've detailed some of this already, so you can have this slide and have a closer look if you want. The main message that I want you to get is the ETS system is meant to bring all these energy intensive industries, so energy, cement, steel, metal, glass, lime, paper, chemicals, aviation, shipping, to reduce their emissions by 62% by 2030. So this is quite an ambitious target. And the two ways in which they will do that is that they will reduce the number of free allowances. So that's what I was mentioning before. So the emissions that are not paid for by those industries. And they will also reduce the total of ETS allowances that are available on the market. The short story is the CO2 emissions will increase basically, and so this will be important in the whole business case that was already mentioned in the discussion for how synthetic aviation fuel can compete basically with their fossil equivalent. I'll leave you this slide. I mentioned most of this already, so you can have a closer look if you want. I just added this slide before because there was a question about RED 3. So I mentioned the sustainable quota. Overall, the target of the EU is to reach this 42.5% of renewable energy by 2030. So this means like biomass, renewable energy sources like wind power, hydro, solar, and so on. Bear in mind that RFNBOs, for example, contribute to this 42.5%. So that's one of the ways where countries can demonstrate that they're reaching this 42.5% is by using, for example, renewable fuels of non-biological origin. So these are quite groundbreaking, let's say, adoption at EU level. We can discuss in the Q&A what are the, let's say, the specific elements that are attached to this adoption. I mentioned the Refuel EU Aviation. I've listed there. Basically, what you see on the left is the original proposal from the Commission. So with the broad umbrella SAF target and then the specific RFNBO target under it. Then you have the targets as they were set in their position by the Council. Then the targets as they were set by the EU Parliament. And now basically those three institutions are coming together and finding agreements. So you can expect that some of the final numbers will be somewhere between what the Parliament is calling for and what the Commission and the Council were calling for. For us, what is essential in there is that we have ambitious targets, in particular for our FNBOs, in order to help the ramp up of RFNBO production and to put as soon as possible, basically, the industry in the right track to be able to produce those RFNBOs at very large scale. Maybe just to finish in the few minutes that I have left, so you have all the parts about new regulations that are coming, and as I try to show you that these are quite ambitious, we can discuss the detail, but in essence, the EU is saying we need RFNBOs for aviation, and this is the way we want to go. Now, currently, there are legislations that are being adopted under the current regulations, let's say. So there is what is coming in the future, but right now we're under the regulation of RED 2. So RED 3 has been adopted, but the current regulation is still RED 2, and there are still technical rules that are needed for understanding how we define RFNBOs and how we reach the 70% threshold that I've mentioned in my previous slide. And so the European Commission published new rules under RED 2, which are referred to as the delegated acts. So as I was mentioning, it's kind of like decrees of application. Those rules are under scrutiny until June 2023. That means that parliamentarians can either reject or not reject the rules. They can't, in theory, amend it. Same for EU governments. And there's two types of delegated acts. So the first delegated act is on additionality. This links as well to what Daniel was presenting earlier. It's basically rules saying, how can you demonstrate that the renewable energy that you're using for RFNBO is coming from new installations and that you're not cannibalizing, if you forgive me the word, renewable energy that could be otherwise used directly. And so there's a number of, let's say, stringent provisions to demonstrate that the renewable energy that you use is being produced at the same time, in a geographical location that is close to the place where you're making your CCU fuel and so on, that is being proposed. So I won't go into more detail on additionality, but bear in mind that this is one of the delegated acts that the European Commission has put forward. And then the second one, which is more relevant for the discussion today. So as I mentioned before, the qualification, whether you're an RFNBO or a biofuel, is where your energy is coming from. But in the proposed rules from the Commission, there are a number, in particular on the GHG methodology. So this is about how do you reach the 70%. And in there, the European Commission is telling you, you need to differentiate between the carbon sources that you can use. So they make a difference between 5 carbon sources. The first 3 are, or the first 4, sorry, are eligible without an end date. So that means that in the foreseeable future until 2050, you'll be able to use that CO2 in your RFNBO without an end date. This is direct air capture CO2, biogenic CO2 that respects a RED 2 criteria. So essentially CO2 coming from biomass. Then the CO2 coming from RFNBOs or coming from RCFs. So if you manage to recapture and reuse the CO2 from your FNBO, and then geological CO2. This is mostly linked to geothermal activity. But then, if you want to use industrial CO2 coming from power production, so for example, from a gas-fired power plant, you can do that only until 2036. If you want to use industrial CO2 coming from industrial production at large, so for example, emissions from a cement plant, you can do that only until 2041. To try to explain what is the logic of the Commission there is that they say we want to avoid that we create lock-in effects basically for fossil CO2, and they hope that in the ramp-up phase, CO2 from different sources can be used, but that at some point, the CO2 in 2036 and 2041 can be replaced by more sustainable, basically, CO2 that is in line with the climate neutrality target that they have in mind. As CO2 Value Europe, we're making the case that we need to have access to CO2 wherever it comes from, at least for the ramp-up phase, and that bringing those sunset clause may be an issue for having industries basically investing into RFNBOs in the short term. But we can exchange in the Q&A if you're interested. I have been a bit long, so I'll just wrap up in 1 minute. The key message that I want to share is EU policies are going in the right directions. We have quotas that are being discussed. We have financial incentives that are being discussed. we have a framework that starts to be quite complete. So all of these are important, let's say, signals that are given for the production of synthetic aviation fuels. There's a number of questions that remain. I just mentioned this sunset clause that can be an issue. It was referenced also previously, but the question of whether, from a price perspective, from a cost perspective, synthetic aviation fuels can compete with biofuels, for example. There's also the elements around fiscal rules, for example, to disincentivize the use of oil kerosene versus e-kerosene, and the broader kind of question of whether businesses and consumers will accept the benefits and the costs of synthetic aviation fuels. So these are all questions that will remain super important in the coming months and in the coming policy discussions. Our broad message to policymakers is that we need to have long-term policy and financial incentives to move away from fossil fuels. Sorry, I was a bit long. I hope that some of this information was relevant, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Trudy. As expected, there are some questions on this topic, so I'll take them one by one. We have 7 minutes. So first question from Thomas Anderson is, what would the effect be of the delegated acts of the RED II on the long-term commitment to producing RFNBO from CO2? If the CO2 available for RFNBO is supposed to decrease in the next 30 to 40 years, would it still be feasible to continue with these kinds of operation?
Okay, that's a difficult one. So as I mentioned, from our perspective, we see the sunset clause, for example, as possibly a disincentive for companies to start to invest into those RFNBO production, because it will be hard for them to depreciate their project in 15 years, basically. So we see that as a first consequence. The second argument that we bring to the Commission is to say, what happens for industries that will not have access to storage? Because essentially the vision of the Commission is to say, okay, we reduce ETS emissions with a linear factor up to 2050, but then what happens for, let's say, a company that is somewhere in France or somewhere in Eastern Europe that will not get access to, for example, CCS, to long-term storage? So this is one of the questions that we're asking with this sunset clause. I don't know if this answers fully the questions, but that were the two things coming to mind.
Yeah, and for the long-term commitment, what is clear is that there needs to be a significant investment in the development of direct air capture. So that's clear. So that an RFNBO facility that is ongoing now and until 2040 has a certain access to industrial CO2, that they could rather easily switch this source to DAC-related CO2 or biogenic CO2. So this is indispensable to have a clear investment now in the large-scale deployment of direct air capture, is something that would be needed for the long-term commitment when this industrial CO2 is not available anymore for RFNBO production. There was a question on the double counting, and just to confirm, the question says, does it mean that whoever captures the CO2, for example, the cement plant, gets the full credit, and who converts it gets none? So that was when you talked about the ETS and the avoiding double counting. Maybe I can directly answer to that. It's so far the ETS says that the CO2 will be accounted for when at the point of the industrial activity, but it doesn't say who will get the credit for capturing it and for using it. And this is appended to a further implementing regulation that will try to come up with a methodology of where exactly the CO2 will be accounted for and who gets a credit. But for the moment, the ETS suggests that the CO2 will be accounted for in at the moment of the initial release, so to say.
Yeah.
So there is still work on that, and we're expecting further developments, and we will be also participating in the discussions of how to make sure that all parties see an incentive in capturing and using the CO2, and that there is no double counting at the end, that there is only once counted. All of it is accounted for once, but there is avoidance of double counting. There's another question about the CO2 from industrial sources, so we kind of touched it. Will it be eligible for e-fuel projects in the long term? So I think we already answered that for a cement industry.
So basically 2041 under the draft regulation. Yeah.
Maybe you can comment on the potential review also, Trudy.
Yeah, that's true. So like in the revision, there is a specific element that says that the European Union will revise those two dates, so the 2036 and 2041, as part of the state talk of the stock take, sorry, of the Paris Agreement by Europe. So basically Europe saying, okay, we need to see if we're on track for the Paris Agreement. We need to set 2040 targets, and as part of this positioning, they may review those deadlines. So when you talk with the Commission, that's one of the elements that they mentioned, that it is also pending that they would be able to revise those dates if they considered at a later point in time that they're not appropriate for reaching RFNBO targets, basically.
Other question: who is mandated to cover those quotas? Are they airlines or the countries? And what about international airlines that operate in the EU?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So now I'm confused between maritime and airlines. I can double check. So in essence, if airlines don't comply with the quotas, they will be supposed to pay penalties. Like the system is set, they will absolutely need to reach the quotas. And to answer the other question that I see, they won't be able to offset emissions if they don't reach the quota. That is not the way that it will work. They will need to demonstrate that they're reaching the quota, and that's one of the reasons why, from a business case perspective, some of the companies that are working on RFNBO are including that in their calculation to say, okay, synthetic aviation fuel may be costly compared to fossil equivalent, but you need to take into consideration the whole system as it will be set. So the offset will not work. On the mandates as such, I need to double check in the legislation. I don't have it on top of my mind.
Okay. I'll take the last question before going into the final speaker, and it was some further explanation on the statement that 95% of the cost differential for e-fuels will be covered from the ETS aviation. Was that only in reference to the ETS innovation and the sustainable aviation fuel funds, or also considering incentives generated by other policies like the Refuel EU?
So the 95% is in the ETS aviation. So there is a specific part that is on innovation fund. So that's the 450 million. And then the 1.8 billion euros. This is really as we know that the sector will face a number of challenges to transition. And we want to dedicate that money to support and to cover the cost differential for the production of RFNBOs for aviation. So this is not specifically only the innovation fund. This is a dedicated mechanism for supporting the aviation sector specifically to move towards more sustainable fuels.
Thank you. So there is another question that is interesting, but we don't have time to answer it. But I would ask Loin maybe to check it in the chat. It's about the specifications of FT fuels or other synthetic carbon mixes to meet the jet fuel specs, and how difficult it is. So maybe you can answer it in the chat, Loin. And all the other questions we'll try to answer them in the chat that we haven't already answered. But in the interest of time, let me go to our final speaker, Henrik Wenzel, full professor from SDU, that will talk about how are we close of reaching cost competitiveness for synthetic and sustainable aviation fuels?
Right. Thank you so much. I will try and share. I'm a little bit in doubt. You do see anything now, or am I sharing the wrong screen?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet.
No.
Yes.
Yes,
Now it's working.
And then full screen. So now you see it?
Now we see it. Thank you.
Super. And now my marker is also working. Right. So the title that I was given and accepting could SAF become a cost competitive solution to defossilize the aviation industry? And I have chosen this content of my presentation. First, I would like to give you a couple of late news from Denmark on this topic, then talk about the e-fuel competitiveness against fossil fuel, and then e-fuel competitiveness economically against biofuel. Then preconditions for cost break-even between e-kerosene and fossil kerosene. Finally, a small word on the possibility of having a dual feedstock in the Fischer-Tropsch e-kerosene pathway and the benefit of that, because in takeoff that is a reference point. And I would like to have a discussion about what are the options for cost reductions in the Fischer-Tropsch pathway itself. And then if time allows, I have a couple of slides on the total carbon balance at full electrification, first in Denmark and then globally. Let's see if time allows that. Right. So first, some late news from Denmark. To the left bottom, we have a plant under construction for biocatalysis of CO2 with hydrogen to methane. So it's an e-methane production facility that is, as we speak, being built. And this is a picture a couple of months old with the first phase of the erection of these reactors. So it's kind of biogas reactors, but they are fed only with CO2 and hydrogen. Also some inert methane passes through them from the biogas. And then the microorganism called archaea is converting the CO2 and hydrogen to methane. Already this year, it will be operating in semi-full scale, 4 million cubic meters of e-methane per year. And next year, full scale, 13 million cubic meters of e-methane per year to be sold to the grid. And the actors are the biogas producer Nature Energy, company called Biogas Clean, who is building the reactors, and then a company called Andel. They are doing the electrolysis and installation to the grid. And then ourselves, this is actually an invention of ours, this reactor. The reason that it's relevant in an aviation fuel context is, of course, that it gives a way to use a steam methane reactor to produce an e-fuel, an e-kerosene, through an e-methane, and then through the SMR and the Fischer-Tropsch and e-kerosene. And that is located down here near Sønderborg, close to the German border. Next year, we will have an e-methanol production plant producing 32,000 tons per year up here near the Danish town of Åbenrå in Danish. It's going to be dedicated to produce POM plastic, polyoxymethylene plastic for Lego, the toy producer, and Novo, the insulin producer, are going to use this plastic, and they invested in it as well. So, and it's the company European Energy, a Danish company that acts throughout the world, that is erecting a solar park and the electrolysis to produce the methanol as well. This is a drawing of it. It's not the plant itself, but that's already next year. And of course, a methanol to jet pathway is on the way from several actors, but not under installation as we speak. Then by 2026, an e-kerosene and naphtha plant is planned to be in operation, producing 55,000 tons of e-kerosene per year and 25,000 tons of e-naphtha. built by Arcadia eFuels, and Shell is the off-taker, and Sunclass, a Danish chartering airline, is buying this, and they've made an agreement on that. And lastly, 1 year after, 2027, a little bit bigger e-kerosene and naphtha plant, again using reverse water gas shift and Fischer-Tropsch, is under planning to be built near Aalborg by Copenhagen infrastructure partners. And as an answer to one of the previous questions, the investment to this comes from the Danish pension funds, the biggest Danish pension fund. Then Renault Nord, who is an waste incineration company, and the CO2 will come from that. And Aalborg Forsyning, which is a district heating company. They are partners in this. So it's actually just around the corner in Denmark, where it's not far ahead. And it's interesting, this co-production of kerosene and naphtha is pretty interesting. It's correct that the span of carbon chain length from Fischer-Tropsch is a little bit broad, but as long as the naphtha is also in demand, which it is, it's quite interesting. And interestingly, these two quite small plants, the quantity of naphtha from these is equivalent to the whole quantity of recycled plastic in Denmark, which we have achieved through 2 decades. We are now looking at the same quantity that will arise from these 2 plants alone, of a much cleaner, much more pure plastic. So in the whole plastic and waste management sector, the co-production of kerosene and naphtha is really interesting. It will change the plastic and waste management agenda quite significantly, if you ask me. So these were just some late news from Denmark that I thought could be interesting, and especially using this methane together with the reverse water gas shift in a Fischer-Tropsch pathway. So you have both the methane through a steam reforming, and the reverse water gas shift is a benefit. I'll end up by showing that. So some years back, a couple of years ago, I had 2 PhD students who took a challenge that I gave them. There was a tendency that many decision makers believe that at some point we will make cost competitive fuels like e-fuels. We just need more research. And as this is the topic of my speak today, when and if will e-fuels be competitive to fossil fuels? This study is pretty relevant, because I challenged the 2 students to say, why don't you make a total overview of all the fossil fuels in the world and all the reserves that we have of oil and gas and coal, and let us assume that we make a diesel out of those. Of course, the oil we just need to refine, but the gas and the coal, of course, we can convert to a diesel as well. And let's take a look at the cost of doing that and sum up all the reserves in the world in kind of a sum curve, a frequency curve, and then compare what we know about all the biofuels and e-fuels we have out there and the techno-economic data on those, and then compare them and see how far are we from being competitive today, and what do we believe will happen in the future. So what you see here on the x-axis is the quantities of proven reserves by 2015 in the world, equivalent to 40,000 exajoules. Of course, the resources are these proven reserves. The definition is that they are, in this case by 2015, economically feasible to extract. So the base of the resources is much bigger, probably up to 10 times bigger. And on the y-axis to your left, you have the price of a propellant, a diesel equivalent being produced out of these fossil reserves. And on the right-hand side, x-axis is the same, just as dollars per barrel, because these are numbers that you're more used to see. So let's take a look. This was the explanation of the axis. So on the x-axis again, all the purple color is the oil reserves, and the yellow gas reserves, and the black are the coal reserves. So the cheapest place, this is country by country, the cheapest place in the world to produce a diesel equivalent out of a fossil fuels is Kuwait. The first three contributions in the bar graph here are the mining, the capex and opex and administration of mining. Then the orange is the refining, and the blue is the distribution logistics until the fueling. So this is the cost of producing a diesel from the Kuwait reserve. The next is Oman, smaller quantity, a little bit more expensive. And as you go, here comes Denmark, still the oil reserves, small quantity together with Germany and the Netherlands, that is. If we go to Canadian oil, this is the shale oil that is pretty much more expensive. You see, meanwhile, you have the gas reserves here where the refining part is bigger because you need to do gas to liquid, which is more expensive. Looking at the coal, the Russian coal is the cheapest coal reserve to do this from. A bit more expensive, and all the way up to the most expensive, which is the South Korean, Japan, Turkey, and Iranian coal reserves. So that's the total sum graph of the cost of producing a diesel equivalent from fossil reserves. If we are to stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade temperature increase, we can only, remember this was from 2015, we could only use what is to the left of this line. All the other had to stay in the ground, otherwise we couldn't make it. And for 2 degrees, this is the quantity. So that allows us, of course, to understand if we are to find sustainable alternatives that can outcompete these on pure market terms, what should be the cost of those? And if we take a look, this is it. So to stay below, to succeed in competing with our sustainable alternatives like the e-fuels, and just on a pure market competition basis, meeting the climate target of 2 degrees, we need a cost of something around $8 per gigajoule of diesel equivalent, and something around 7 if we are to stay below 1.5. So this is kind of a nice target to understand. Can we do that is the next question. We studied a huge variety of biofuels and e-fuels and even electrification and so on to understand to what extent could we do this. And the lowest cost of biofuels, of e-fuels, electrofuels, back then we found was 22 gigajoules per diesel equivalent. That is equivalent to $0.75 per liter. And that was assuming an electricity cost behind the hydrogen production of $18 per megawatt hour of electricity. That is equivalent to very cheap solar power back then. As those of you who know these numbers will realize that this is pretty cheap. This is, of course, diesel, but the proportion, if it were to be jet fuel, is just about the same. So you see, this is from 2.5 times more expensive than the cheapest diesel to 50% more expensive than the cheapest diesel. So it is a pretty cheap aviation fuel that we have assumed here by 2040. It is difficult to get cheaper than that. Let's take a look then. I'll go back to what would it take in terms of preconditions to then be competitive anyway. But let me take a short detour to comparing with biofuels. And I have a case of methane, where I'm comparing an e-methane to a biomethane made from straw. And the reason to compare making it from straw is that straw is the next future large-scale substrate for biogas. We have almost used all the industrial waste types in Denmark, and the manure part is only a little bit cheaper to use for biomethane than straw. But straw is the big and new marginal source of biomass for biogas. If you look at the cost of biomass, and assuming that following the x-axis, which is the temporal scale until 2050, assuming that we are striving to meet our climate targets. And if we have a biomass strategy to do that, a bioenergy strategy, energy prices or prices of biomass will increase, because at today's prices of biomass on the market, that those prices are proportional to the scale of the demand. And if the demand is increasing significantly, so will the price, because the more expensive locations to produce biomass in the world will come into play. And that's a conventional demand and supply relation. And we have even some data from the scientific literature showing today's prices and what would happen in the longer term if we like double or triple the biomass supply. And this would be the expected increase. We assume the straw to follow this to some extent, because they are to some extent able to substitute each other in many applications. And this is today's straw prices, and we have assumed a slight increase like this. Then last year there was a publication from Bloomberg NEF projecting the hydrogen price or the hydrogen production cost, going from today's like $4 or $5 per kilogram of hydrogen, lowering towards 1 point something. So being reduced by a factor of 3.5 to 4 over time, due to economy of scale, due to development in solar power, especially to some extent wind power as well, being cheaper over time, also due to economy of scale and technology innovation from those. Hydrogen prices are expected to do the opposite as wood chip prices or wood biomass prices as such. They are going to decrease. And if we believe the Bloomberg NEF projection here, which I've spoken to many people who agree on this, we could see that hydrogen prices will cross the biomass price at some point. The investment cost of converting hydrogen into methane in a biomethanation reactor is very small. What I have assumed here is this much going from the blue to the green curve, and that is probably in the longer term exaggerated, because it's very, very inexpensive. It's a very simple technology to produce a methanation reactor. But as you see here, this is the cost of producing biomethane from straw, and already by 2026, it will be just as cheap, if we believe in this cost, to produce e-methane as to produce biomethane from straw. The blue curve here from Bloomberg NEF was in France, located in France, but I believe it to be the same in Denmark, because we have a somewhat less solar radiation, but we can sell the process heat for district heating, which they did not assume to be done in France. So I do believe that this represents our hemisphere. And that's interesting. And I did the same for methanol, and I would see exactly the same relation between biomethanol and e-methanol here. And of course, as you can make jet fuel out of both methanol and methane, this will be the same tendency for e-kerosene. And that's interesting, and it's good news for the insects and the biodiversity in general, because at some point, I do believe that even with direct air capture, here, of course, the CO2 is for free because it's in the biogas, but including direct air capture, it will only increase the cost by something like 20%. So at some point, e-fuels will be cheaper than biofuels, and also more sustainable. Back then to the what would it take to meet the for e-kerosene to meet the fossil kerosene price. And here we played with assuming a CO2 tax. And if now we have changed the y-axis scale, so it's this dotted blue line is the same as here, but the scale has changed, so it's still $22 per gigajoule. And what we see here is that we need to meet the 2 degrees centigrade target, we need a CO2 tax of $190 per ton of CO2 on top of the fossil fuel price. That will give us a break even. And $190 per ton of CO2 is actually within the range that we are speaking about for CO2. To meet the 1.5 degree, we need 210. So in round numbers, around $200 per ton of CO2 will do the trick. But without it, forget about it. We also tried looking at how much should we lower the electricity price compared to the assumed price we had from before, the $18 per megawatt hour of electricity. How much lower should that be if e-kerosene produced from Fischer-Tropsch and hydrogen and Fischer-Tropsch should be competitive? And what we found is that to meet the 2 degrees centigrade target, assuming even that the CO2 is for free, we would have to have a cost as low as $4.57 per megawatt hour of electricity. Then we would be competitive. And to meet the 1.5 degree target, $0.32 per megawatt hour, meaning almost zero cost electricity. And of course, we have to pay for the CO2 to capture it as well. So that will increase, we would need negative electricity prices in this case. And to understand why is it the case that it's so difficult, you just have to imagine the physical issues here. If you want to produce an e-fuel, an e-kerosene, you have to buy a solar plant or a wind turbine or something equivalent. You have to invest in a grid. You have to buy an electrolysis. You have to capture CO2. You have to invest in a reverse water gas shift and in a Fischer-Tropsch and all that. And after that, you have a syncrude that is almost similar, very close to being similar to the fossil syncrude that you, or the fossil crude oil that you pump out of the ground. So all these investments should compete with a pump, if it comes from oil at least. And that's difficult. I had then to finalize, I had some very good students doing an optimizer study of a Fischer-Tropsch e-kerosene pathway. And this slide is very busy, I do know, and it's not that you should capture the details of this, but you should understand how it's done. It's modeled in a tool called CIFRA that is developed by the Danish transmission system operator EnergyNet. And what it does is that if you enter the preconditions for the variety of unit operations that you can have in pathways, the variety of electrolyzer technologies, the alkaline and the SOEC, co-electrolysis for converting to syngas, reverse water gas shift for converting to syngas, biomethane and steam reformer to convert to syngas, and connecting or not connecting the photovoltaic to the grid, all the variety, and then let the optimizer minimize the cost under various system settings of electricity costs, etc. Then the tool will come out, the model will come out with the distribution of what has been invested in and what does the levelized cost of energy of e-kerosene end up being in these cases. And the winning scenario, they modeled like 9 scenarios here. The winning scenario was this one. So it's producing jet fuel out here and naphtha, some tail gas, and the heat is used for district heating. Most of it, not all. What you see is we have a biogas supply going through a biogas scrubber where the CO2 is extracted. The biomethane goes into a steam reformer, and the carbon monoxide to hydrogen ratio is adjusted by reverse water gas shift to use some of the excess hydrogen from the steam reformer with CO2 to get the right ratio of 2.15 to the Fischer-Tropsch. Furthermore, electrolysis and a lot of CO2 that is available is used in reverse water gas shift to produce a syngas. Also, a co-electrolysis pathway is used to directly produce syngas from CO2 and hydrogen. So that is the pathway, and we ended up. You see the size of the flows here, that there is a significant flow of biomethane that will go through steam reformer into the Fischer-Tropsch, as well as the syngas from co-electrolysis and reverse water gas shift. And that was interesting because the optimizer could as well have set this to 0. So why is it that also biomethane is used here? By the way, it also shows between the electrolyzers, it shows mainly alkaline electrolyzer due to the lower investment cost, and some co-electrolysis as well. And these are the costs. And the cheapest scenario was this one out here, and they found a levelized cost of e-kerosene of 1.2 euros per liter. And that is about twice the fossil kerosene market price today, which is lower than we see in most studies. But this is because this is looking ahead to 2040, and it is because of the assumed lower electricity prices we assume at that time. Here we have two curves from the international collaboration project called TIN-DP, done in 2020, doing scenarios for 2040. It's a collaboration between European transmission system operators, including the Danish one, EnergyNet. And the scenario that was recommended by then was the blue one, where you see the frequency function over the 8,760 hours per year. Here, that has a plateau around 30, 35 or less, 20 something euros per megawatt hour of electricity. And then some hours of very low prices. This is called the national trend scenario for 2040. And this is called the distributed energy scenario. And what this study found was that there is a break-even point at around 30, 35 euros per megawatt hour, where the syngas would be produced from the electro pathway, either the reverse water gas shift or the co-electrolysis, and below. Sorry, it should be above this price. Sorry, it would choose to produce biomethane instead for the syngas production, and that would be equivalent to producing 75% of the syngas from the E pathway and 25% from the bio pathway. Because when electricity prices on the grid are higher than 30 to 35 euros per megawatt hour, it pays simply off better to sell directly to the grid than to produce the e-kerosene from it, or to produce the syngas. So that combination of being able to use methane, and today we would also include e-methane in this, when electricity prices are high, and to make the syngas from CO2 and hydrogen directly when electricity prices are low. That allows for a cost minimization, which is significant. It also solves a lot of the flexibility and storage issues, because when you produce biomethane or e-methane, you store it on the gas grid, and we have a lot of storage, like for example in Denmark, on that, and that then has a constant price. And whenever electricity becomes too costly, we'll just draw on that resource of feedstock at a constant price. So I don't know how much time is left, but I have set up discussion, and then I have some extra slides if necessary.
Thank you very much, Henrik. We are past the time that we have scheduled, but there is, if everybody's okay with that, a couple of questions that can be answered here from the chat. So Tom Strangers asks that the prices for green hydrogen now are way higher than what were depicted in the slides, and he was asking what are the assumptions behind the hydrogen prices.
I think it's true production cost prices. So it's simply the cost of making, and I think that especially solar power and the cost of making solar power is underlying these assumptions. And then it's the cost of electrolysis. And of course, the hydrogen prices that you see are influenced by other things than true production cost. But this is what Bloomberg assumed, at least.
Okay.
And I do think that, I mean, I understood that the cost of like $5 per kilogram of hydrogen is not unrealistic also today. And that is actually where the curve is starting. Oh, that's maybe too far back. Yeah. This is equivalent to close to $5 per kilogram.
Okay. And another question from Pietro Garato is, when the price of electricity is lowered, would this not only lower the cost of producing e-kerosene, but also the cost of producing fossil kerosene? And whether this has been considered in the analysis?
I don't think that electricity price is a very big contributor to producing fossil kerosene.
Okay. And another question from Tom is whether the costs that you have shown on RFNBO production are considering also compliance to the delegated acts of that govern the production of RFNBO so far.
I'm not sure I understand that question.
I assume it might mean whether, let's say, the delegated acts that show that they need the RFNBO need to be 70%, for example, less greenhouse gas emissions than the fossil equivalent. Is this also considered in your analysis?
Yeah, implicitly it is, because we are here looking at 2040, maybe even 2050, and by then we can assume that we have at least that degree of renewable electricity in our system.
And a kind of existential question from Ahmed is that, sorry if I may have misunderstood, but is one of the conclusions from the analysis that there is no feasible way to make SAF cheaper than conventional kerosene in the foreseeable future?
It will never happen. You can compete with fossil fuels if the market prices are sufficiently high, but you can never outcompete them because they can be produced at $5 per barrel or something, you know, from the cheapest locations. So, and it will never be possible. It's simply the value of that stored fossil fuel that is given to us from plants and microorganisms through millions of years is so high that producing it from scratch, from CO2 and water, we can never compete. And it's a really, really important acknowledgement, because there are politicians out there who think just need to set aside more money for research and then scientists will do it for us. It will never happen. We need regulation to make the sustainable e-fuels competitive.
Okay. And final question, that the co-product income seems to have a quite significant impact in the analysis. First of all, what products are considered? Only raw naphtha, or also the potential fuels, for example, for road transport?
Oh, in essence, only naphtha. Yeah, it's naphtha is the large scale side product. The others are quite small, at least in this study. Of course, you can modify through hydrocracking to some extent, but it's the easiest is the co-production of kerosene and naphtha, and there is a big market for the naphtha as well.
And there was a second, let's say, element to the question. Might it be more favorable even to increase the share of the co-products from an economic point of view rather than increase the SAF product?
Could be. I don't know for now, because these markets need to mature a little bit more. But I do believe that as far as we have understood, I've talked also to the German BASF producing plastics, and today the prices of green naphtha are higher than we have assumed here for the e-kerosene and e-naphtha together. So there are, but this market can change rapidly because it's a demand and supply issue, and you have a supply bottleneck here.
Okay. So we are past our time. So I think, yeah, I see a hand up from Tudi.
Sorry. I just wanted to make a slight precision on something that I said earlier about the mandate and who is responsible. So having a look at the legislation again, and so we're still waiting for the final legislation to be out. So when the final legislation is out, we'll know for sure. But just for everyone to have it clearly in mind. So essentially, there's two types of penalties. The major penalty is going to be on the fuel supplier, and then there's a smaller part of the penalty that is going to be on aircraft operators. But if we're real, let's say if we face it, in the end, some of the prices and of the risks will still be still be ended to the aircraft operators. But just so that I'm clearer, maybe in the answer that I gave. So the main penalties for fuel supplier, then a part of the penalties on aircraft operators formally in the legislation. Okay, sorry, thanks. I just wanted to make sure that I got that right.
Thanks, Tudi, for this clarification. So we have concluded our webinar. Let me thank all participants, all speakers, and also the CO2 Value Europe team for organizing this. If you want to stay in touch with the Takeoff project and its developments, please reach out. These are the ways of reaching out. Also reach out to CO2 Value Europe if you have any questions about the fate of CO2 and how it can be used. Thank you to Loin, Tudi, Danielle, and Henrik for their insights. And wishing you a very nice week. We hope the webinar was fruitful and useful for you. And know that we will share the slides afterwards and the recording to the participants and through the website of the Takeoff project. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.